Waitress refused to serve the rude billionaire until she saw the photo in his wallet. What if the most difficult customer you ever served was carrying a secret that would change everything you thought you knew about kindness? Grace had been waiting tables at Miller's Diner for 12 years, serving coffee and comfort to truckers, families, and lonely souls who wandered in from the highway. She'd seen every type of customer imaginable, but nothing prepared her for the man in the expensive suit who stormed through the door on that rainy Tuesday evening. His voice cut through the warm chatter of the diner like a cold blade. He snapped his fingers at Grace, complained about everything from the temperature of the water to the speed of service, and treated her like she was invisible. For a moment, Grace felt her patience wearing thin. She'd raised 2 children on tips and had learned to bite her tongue, but this man was testing every ounce of her southern hospitality. Then his wallet fell open, and everything changed. "Where are you watching from tonight?" Grace wiped down the counter for the 3rd time that evening, her calloused hands moving in the familiar rhythm that had sustained her family for over a decade. At 38, she'd learned to read people the moment they walked through Miller's glass doors. The truckers who needed a friendly ear, the traveling salesman who just wanted hot coffee and silence, the elderly couples who came for the early bird special and stayed for the warmth. But the man who entered at 7:15 was different. Everything about him screamed money, from his tailored charcoal suit to the gold watch that caught the fluorescent lights. He chose the corner booth without waiting to be seated, his phone already pressed to his ear as he barked orders to someone on the other end. "I don't care what the weather's like in Chicago," he said, his voice carrying across the half-empty diner. "The deal closes tomorrow or we find someone else who can handle it." Grace approached with her usual smile, the one that had earned her regular customers who requested her section specifically. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to Miller's. Can I start you with some coffee?" He barely glanced up. "Water. Room temperature. And I need to see a menu immediately." "No please. No thank you." Just demands delivered like she was his personal servant. As Grace poured his water, she noticed his hands were shaking slightly. Despite his commanding presence, something beneath the surface seemed fragile. Years of serving people had taught her to look beyond the obvious, to see the tiredness in a businessman's eyes or the loneliness behind an elderly woman's sharp words. "Take your time with the menu," she said gently. "Tonight's special is our homemade meatloaf with mashed potatoes and green beans. It's been a favorite for 20 years. He looked up then, his steel-gray eyes meeting hers for the first time. "I didn't ask for recommendations. I asked for a menu." Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she simply nodded and returned with the laminated menu. As she set it down, she noticed he'd moved on to another phone call, this one quieter but somehow more intense. "Listen to me carefully," he was saying. "If you can't handle this tonight, there will be consequences." The way he said consequences sent a chill through Grace, and she began to wonder what kind of man she was really serving. For the next hour, the man transformed Grace's normally peaceful shift into an endurance test. Nothing met his standards. The soup was too hot, then too cold when she brought a fresh bowl. The bread wasn't fresh enough. The lighting at his table was wrong, too bright, then too dim when she adjusted it. "Excuse me," he called out, loud enough for other customers to turn and stare. "This coffee tastes like it's been sitting for hours." Grace had brewed it fresh 20 minutes ago. She knew because Mrs. Henderson, her regular at table 6, had complimented her on it. But she simply smiled and offered to make a new pot. "Ma'am," Mrs. Henderson whispered as Grace passed her table, "that man's been nothing but rude to you. You don't have to take that." Grace squeezed the elderly woman's shoulder gratefully. In her 12 years here, she'd learned that every customer carried their own burdens. Maybe this man was fighting a battle she couldn't see. When she returned with fresh coffee, he was ending another call. This time, his voice had changed completely. Gone was the harsh businessman's tone, replaced by something soft and broken. "I know, sweetheart," he was saying. "Daddy's trying his best. The doctors said, yes, I know it hurts. I'm going to fix this, I promise." Grace froze at the coffee station, her heart suddenly racing. The tenderness in his voice was like hearing a completely different person. When he hung up, she saw him bury his face in his hands for just a moment before straightening his tie and rebuilding the walls around himself. As she refilled his cup, his wallet slipped from the table and fell open on the floor. Grace bent to retrieve it, and that's when she saw the photograph tucked in the front pocket. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, with the same steel-gray eyes but a smile that could light up the world. She wore a hospital gown, and her small bald head was covered with a colorful knitted cap. Grace's hands trembled as she handed back the wallet. The man's eyes met hers, and for a split second, she saw past the armor he wore. She saw a father who was drowning. If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up. Without a word, he took the wallet and slipped the photo back inside. But the damage was done. Grace had seen his truth, and everything about this difficult evening suddenly made perfect sense. Grace couldn't focus on her other tables. Every time she looked at the man in the corner booth, she saw that photograph burned into her memory. A sick child. A desperate father. She'd raised 2 healthy kids, but she'd also volunteered at the children's hospital downtown. She knew that particular brand of exhaustion, the way hope and fear could eat a person alive from the inside. 20 minutes later, his phone rang again. This time, Grace was close enough to hear both sides of the conversation. "Mr. Davidson? This is Dr. Reynolds from Children's Memorial. I'm afraid there's been a complication with Lily's treatment." Grace watched the man's face drain of color. His name was Davidson, and his daughter was Lily. What kind of complication? His voice was barely above a whisper now. "Her body isn't responding to the current chemotherapy as well as we'd hoped. We need to discuss alternative treatments, but I won't lie to you. They're experimental and extremely expensive. Even with your insurance." Davidson's hand shook as he gripped the phone. "How much?" "We're looking at another $250,000, possibly more. And there are no guarantees." Grace felt her heart break as she watched this powerful man crumble in real time. When he hung up, he just sat there, staring at the untouched food on his plate. For the first time all evening, he wasn't making demands or barking orders. He was just a father facing the unthinkable. She thought about her own children, Jake, now 22 and working construction, and Beth, 19 and in college. She remembered every scraped knee she'd kissed, every fever she'd worried through. But this was different. This was a parent's worst nightmare. Grace made a decision that would have seemed impossible 2 hours ago. She walked to his table, poured fresh coffee without being asked, and gently placed a slice of their famous apple pie in front of him. "This one's on the house," she said quietly. "My grandmother's recipe. She always said it could heal whatever was hurting you." Davidson looked up at her, and she saw tears threatening to spill from those steel-gray eyes. "I don't deserve your kindness," he said simply. "Maybe not," Grace replied with a gentle smile. "But your little girl does." He broke then, just for a moment. His shoulders shook with the weight he'd been carrying alone. "Have you ever faced something like this? Let us know in the comments." Grace sat down across from him, something she'd never done with a customer in 12 years of service, and waited for him to find his voice again. "Her name is Lily," Davidson said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "She's 6 years old, and she loves butterflies and bedtime stories. 3 months ago, she was running around the playground like any other kid. Now." Grace reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "Now you're fighting for her life." He nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "I've been traveling non-stop, trying to close deals, liquidate assets, anything to pay for her treatment. I sold my house, my cars, even my wife's jewelry. She died 2 years ago, cancer too, and Lily is all I have left." Grace understood now. The phone calls, the desperation disguised as arrogance, the way he'd treated everyone around him like obstacles instead of people. He wasn't a cruel man, he was a drowning man who'd forgotten how to ask for help. "I've been so focused on making money that I forgot how to be human," he continued. "I snapped at doctors, yelled at nurses, treated everyone like they were in my way. And here you are, showing me more kindness than I've shown anyone in months. Grace squeezed his hand. What's your first name? James, he said with a shaky smile. My friends used to call me Jim, back when I had friends. Well, Jim, let me tell you something about this little diner. We've been feeding people and solving problems for 40 years. Old Pete, who owns this place, he's got a soft spot for folks in trouble. And our customers, they're good people too. As if summoned by her words, Mrs. Henderson appeared at their table. She'd been watching from across the room, and her grandmother's intuition had kicked in. Honey, she said to James, I couldn't help but overhear. My late husband fought cancer for 3 years, and I learned something important. You can't carry this burden alone. Before James could protest, Mrs. Henderson was flagging down other customers. Old Pete emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. Slowly, a small crowd gathered around the corner booth. Grace felt tears in her eyes as she watched these ordinary people, truckers, retirees, young couples, listen to James's story. When he finished, the diner fell silent for a moment. Then old Pete spoke up. Lily sounds like she needs some angels looking out for her. If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales. What happened next would restore James's faith in humanity and give little Lily the miracle she needed. What began as a simple gesture of kindness from Grace became something extraordinary. Word spread through the small highway town like wildfire. Mrs. Henderson called her church group. Pete contacted the local radio station. Within hours, the story of little Lily and her father reached hundreds of people who had never met them but understood that love sometimes requires strangers to become family. By the next morning, Miller's Diner had become an unlikely headquarters for hope. Truckers who stopped for coffee left $20 bills marked, "For Lily." A retired teacher organized a bake sale. Local businesses contributed portions of their daily earnings. The story spread to social media, then to regional news stations, creating a ripple effect of compassion that stretched far beyond that small town. James sat in the same corner booth 3 days later, but everything had changed. His phone calls now were to coordinate donations rather than business deals. The harsh edge in his voice had softened into something Grace recognized as gratitude mixed with wonder. The hospital called this morning, he told Grace as she poured his coffee, a ritual that had become comforting rather than confrontational. Between the donations and a research grant that Dr. Reynolds helped us apply for, we have enough for Lily's treatment. All of it. Grace felt tears spring to her eyes. How is she doing? James pulled out his phone and showed her a video message. Little Lily was sitting up in her hospital bed, wearing a bright yellow cap that Mrs. Henderson had knitted for her. She was telling her daddy about the butterflies she'd drawn for all the nice people who were helping her get better. She wants to visit the diner when she's stronger, James said with a laugh that sounded rusty from disuse. She says she wants to thank the angel lady who helped Daddy remember how to smile. Grace wiped her eyes with her apron. That little girl is the angel in this story. James reached across the table and took Grace's hand. I came in here 3 days ago thinking the world was against me. I was angry, desperate, and I'd forgotten that kindness still existed. You could have thrown me out. God knows I deserved it. Instead, you saw what I needed before I even knew I needed it. Sometimes, Grace said softly, we all need someone to see past our worst moments to our best intentions. As James prepared to leave for the hospital, he left an envelope on the table. Inside was a check for the children's wing of the local hospital and a note that simply read, "In honor of Grace and all the angels at Miller's Diner." 6 months later, Grace received a photo in the mail. Lily, with hair growing back in soft brown curls, was running through a field of butterflies, her arms spread wide like she was trying to hug the whole world. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. Sometimes the most beautiful moments come disguised as our most difficult days, and every act of kindness creates ripples we may never see but someone will always feel. Thank you for joining us on this journey of hope, healing, and the reminder that we're all more connected than we know. Waitress donated her kidney to a dying patient, She didn't know he was the billionaire who'd fallen in love with her. What if the kindest person you'd ever met was dying right in front of you, and you had the power to save them? Claire had served coffee to the quiet man in booth 7 every Tuesday morning for 3 months. He always ordered the same thing, black coffee and a blueberry muffin, and always left a $20 tip on a $5 check. She noticed how his hands shook slightly when he reached for his cup, how his breathing seemed labored, how his kind eyes held a sadness she couldn't quite place. She never imagined that David, this gentle soul who asked about her day and listened like her words truly mattered, was fighting for his life. She certainly never dreamed that her impulsive decision to get tested as a kidney donor would change both their lives forever. Sometimes the most extraordinary love stories begin with the simplest act of human kindness, in the most ordinary places. Where are you watching from tonight? Claire had worked at Murphy's Diner for 8 years, ever since her divorce left her starting over at 35. The small-town restaurant wasn't glamorous, but she loved the regulars who'd become like family. Mrs. Peterson always sat at table 3, sharing photos of her grandchildren. Old Joe claimed the counter seat by the window, watching the world go by with his endless cup of coffee. And then there was David. He'd started coming in during the late summer, always alone, always polite. Unlike other customers who chatted on phones or buried their faces in newspapers, David seemed genuinely interested in the people around him. He'd ask Claire how her evening classes were going. She was studying to become a nurse, and remembered details she'd mentioned weeks before. When she told him about her cat getting sick, he'd inquired about the vet visit the following week. "You're studying nursing?" he'd asked one particular Tuesday, his voice hoarse. "That's wonderful. The world needs more people like you." Claire had laughed, refilling his coffee. "People like me? People who care," he'd said simply, and something in his tone made her look at him more carefully. That's when she began noticing the signs. The way he sometimes pressed his hand to his lower back, wincing slightly. How he'd grown thinner over the weeks, his shirts hanging looser. The subtle yellow tinge to his skin that her nursing textbooks had taught her to recognize. David was sick, seriously sick, and trying to hide it. The realization hit her fully on a rainy October morning when she found him slumped over his coffee cup, struggling to catch his breath. She rushed to his side, her training kicking in. "I'm calling an ambulance," she said, reaching for her phone. "No," he managed, gripping her wrist gently. "Please. I just need a moment." But Claire saw the fear in his eyes, the pale sheen of sweat on his forehead. This wasn't just a moment of weakness. This was someone dying by degrees, trying to maintain dignity in the face of an enemy he couldn't defeat alone. "David," she said softly, "what's wrong? Really wrong?" He looked up at her then, and she saw a man who'd been carrying a terrible secret for far too long. David's confession came in broken whispers between labored breaths. End-stage kidney failure. Years of damage from a childhood illness had finally caught up with him. He'd been on the transplant list for 18 months, watching his body slowly surrender while he waited for a donor match that might never come. "The doctors say I have maybe 6 months," he told her, his voice barely audible above the diner's morning bustle. "I come here because—" He paused, struggling. "Because you make me feel human again. Not just a patient with a chart number." Claire's heart shattered and mended simultaneously. She'd lost her father to cancer when she was 22, had watched him waste away in hospital beds surrounded by machines and the antiseptic smell of resignation. But David was different. David still had fight in him, still had hope flickering behind his tired eyes. "There has to be something," she said, sliding into the booth across from him. "Better doctors, experimental treatments." He smiled sadly. "I've tried everything. The best specialists money can buy." He paused, realizing how that sounded. "I mean, I've been fortunate to have good insurance." Claire didn't press about the money comment. Instead, she found herself thinking about her nursing textbooks, about organ donation, about the simple fact that healthy people could live perfectly normal lives with one kidney. She thought about her father, and how she'd have given anything to save him. "What if someone wanted to donate?" she asked quietly. A living donor? David's eyes widened. Claire, no. I can't ask anyone to. You're not asking, she interrupted. I'm offering. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Around them, the diner continued its morning rhythm. Coffee percolating, bacon sizzling, the comfortable chatter of people starting their day. But in booth 7, time had stopped. You don't understand, David said finally. The risks, the surgery, the recovery time. You'd be giving up months of your life for someone you barely know. But Claire was already thinking about the blood work, the compatibility testing, the consultations with transplant coordinators. She was thinking about her father's last words, "Take care of people, sweetheart. That's what matters. If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up." David reached across the table, his trembling hand covering hers. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" Claire smiled through tears she didn't realize had started falling. "Because you're not a stranger anymore." The question was whether she'd be a match, and whether David would let her try. The testing process took 3 weeks that felt like 3 years. Claire underwent blood work, psychological evaluations, and medical examinations that left her feeling like she'd been turned inside out and examined under a microscope. David tried to convince her to change her mind at least a dozen times, but she'd made peace with her decision the moment she'd offered. What she hadn't prepared for was the growing connection between them during those weeks of waiting. David insisted on driving her to appointments when he was feeling strong enough, claiming it was the least he could do. They'd sit in waiting rooms together, sharing stories about their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. Claire learned that David had built his wealth through a chain of healthcare clinics in underserved communities, that he'd never married because he'd been too focused on work, and that he'd been secretly funding college scholarships for single mothers like herself. "You're not just successful," she told him one afternoon as they waited for her final test results. "You're good. Really, genuinely good." He'd looked uncomfortable with the praise. "I've made mistakes. Hurt people without meaning to. Sometimes I think this illness is." "Don't," Claire said firmly. "Don't you dare think you deserve this." The call came on a Wednesday. Claire was working the breakfast shift when Dr. Martinez phoned with news that made her knees buckle. She was a perfect match. Not just compatible, perfect. The kind of match that happens once in 1,000 cases. But there was a complication. David had been admitted to the hospital the night before. His kidney function had dropped precipitously. They had maybe 2 weeks before his condition became critical. Claire found him in room 314, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed like electronic prayers. He looked smaller in the hospital bed, frilier, but his eyes lit up when he saw her. "I heard the good news," he whispered. "Then why do you look so worried?" she asked, settling into the chair beside his bed. "Because I'm falling in love with you," he said simply. "And I can't tell if it's gratitude or something real. And I can't bear the thought of you saving my life, only to discover I'm not worth saving." The honesty of it took her breath away. Claire had dated men who couldn't commit to weekend plans, and here was David, facing death, worried about her heart. Have you ever faced something like this? Let us know in the comments. "What if it's both?" she said, taking his hand. "What if it's gratitude and something real?" The surgery was scheduled for the following Monday. One way or another, their lives would never be the same. The morning of surgery arrived gray and drizzly, matching the anxiety that had kept both Claire and David awake most of the night. They'd been moved to adjoining pre-op rooms, separated by a thin wall that somehow felt like an ocean. Claire could hear the murmur of voices next door as David's surgical team prepared him, and she found herself whispering prayers she'd forgotten she knew. Dr. Martinez stopped by Claire's room at 6 a.m., her expression serious but kind. "Are you ready for this?" she asked. "It's not too late to change your mind." Claire thought about her father, about David's gentle smile, about all the patients she'd care for as a nurse someday. "I've never been more sure of anything." The surgery itself was a blur of anesthesia and dreamless sleep. Claire's last conscious memory was counting backward from 10 and thinking about David's eyes. Her first waking thought, hours later, was whether he was okay. The surgery was perfect, Dr. Martinez told her as she struggled back to consciousness. Your kidney is functioning beautifully in David. His color is already improving. But the real moment came 2 days later, when they wheeled Claire's bed next to David's in the recovery wing. He was sitting up, and for the first time in months, his skin had a healthy flush. The yellow tinge was gone, replaced by something that looked remarkably like hope. "How do you feel?" she asked, her voice still rough from the breathing tube. "Like I've been given a second chance at everything," he said. Then, more quietly, "Claire, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have said weeks ago." She waited, watching emotions play across his face like shadows and sunlight. "I'm not just grateful for what you've done," he began. "I've been in love with you since that first morning when you noticed I was using my left hand because my right was shaking, and you switched my coffee cup without saying a word. You've been taking care of me for months without even realizing it." Claire felt tears starting again, but these were different tears. These were the kind that come with beginnings, not endings. "I love you too," she whispered. "Not because of this. Not because of gratitude. Because you see people. Really see them. The way you saw me." If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales. They were going home in 3 days. Together, they'd decided to start whatever came next. 6 months later, Claire stood in the same diner where their story began, but everything had changed. She was wearing scrubs, she'd graduated nursing school early, her professors moved by her real-world experience with organ donation. David sat in booth 7, no longer as a customer but as the man who'd quietly purchased Murphy's diner to keep it running when old Murphy retired. "You know," Claire said, refilling his coffee cup, a gesture that had become ritual rather than service. "People are going to start talking about the boss showing favoritism to certain employees." David grinned, the color in his cheeks still a daily miracle to both of them. "Let them talk. I happen to think this particular employee deserves a raise." The engagement ring on Claire's finger caught the morning light. It wasn't large or flashy. David had learned that wasn't her style, but it was perfect, with a small inscription inside, 2 hearts, 1 life. Their wedding was planned for the spring, a small ceremony in the community center where David's scholarship recipients gathered monthly. Claire had insisted on something simple, surrounded by the people whose lives had been touched by David's quiet generosity. She'd learned that his wealth came from a tech company he'd sold years earlier, money he'd been systematically giving away through healthcare initiatives and educational programs. "I spent so many years thinking success meant building something big," he'd told her. "But the biggest thing I ever built was the courage to walk into that diner and order coffee from the woman who'd saved my life." The morning rush was winding down when Mrs. Peterson approached their booth, her usual smile even brighter than usual. "You two give an old woman hope," she said, patting Claire's hand. "Real love, the kind that changes everything. That's rarer than people think." As Mrs. Peterson walked away, Claire looked around the diner that had become the center of their universe. The same red vinyl booths, the same coffee-stained counter, the same view of Main Street through windows that had watched thousands of ordinary moments unfold. But now it felt different. It felt like home. "What are you thinking about?" David asked, following her gaze. "How extraordinary things can grow from the most ordinary moments," she said. "How love can start with a cup of coffee and save 2 lives at once." David reached across the table, taking her hand in his. Both of them bore small scars from their surgeries, physical reminders of the choice that had bound them together. But more than that, they were reminders that love, real love, requires courage. The courage to offer what you have to someone who needs it, even when you can't be sure of the outcome. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. Thank you for joining us on this journey of love, sacrifice, and second chances. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most beautiful stories begin with the simplest act of kindness. Billionaire recognizes his old school friend working as a waitress. What if the person who once knew you better than anyone else walked back into your life when you needed them most? Lisa's hands trembled slightly as she balanced the heavy tray of steaming plates, the clatter of silverware and gentle hum of conversation filling the elegant dining room around her. At 38, she had learned to move through life quietly, her dreams tucked away like old photographs in a drawer she rarely opened. The restaurant's soft lighting caught the silver threads that had begun to weave through her dark hair, and though her uniform was pressed and professional, there was something in her eyes that spoke of roads not taken and chances that had slipped away like sand through her fingers. She had no idea that across the room, a man in an expensive suit was watching her with growing recognition, his heart racing as memories from 20 years ago came flooding back like a tide he couldn't stop. "Where are you watching from tonight? I'd love to know." Michael sat at table 12, his fingers drumming nervously against the white tablecloth as he studied the woman who had just served the couple beside him. 20 years had passed since graduation, but he would recognize that gentle way she tucked her hair behind her ear anywhere. Lisa. The girl who had shared her lunch with him every day when his family couldn't afford the school meal plan. The girl who had believed in his wild dreams about starting his own company when everyone else called him foolish. Now, at 42, Michael's technology company was worth billions, his face regularly appearing on magazine covers and business news programs. But sitting in this upscale restaurant, watching Lisa work, none of that seemed to matter. She moved with the same quiet grace he remembered, though he could see the weight of years in the way her shoulders held themselves, as if she had grown accustomed to carrying burdens alone. "Excuse me," he said softly when she approached his table, her notepad ready. She looked up, and for a moment their eyes met. He watched her expression change from polite professionalism to confusion, then to a flash of recognition that made her step back slightly. "Michael." The name escaped her lips like a whisper, her face flushing with a mixture of surprise and something that looked almost like shame. I didn't expect. What are you doing here?" He stood up, his expensive shoes silent on the plush carpet. "Lisa, it's really you. I can't believe it." His voice was warm, genuine, but he could see her glancing around nervously, aware that other diners were beginning to notice their interaction. "I should get back to work," she said quickly, her professional mask sliding back into place. "What can I get you this evening?" But Michael wasn't about to let 20 years of silence stretch into another moment. "When do you get off? Please, I'd love to catch up. I've often wondered what happened to you after we lost touch." The simple question hung in the air between them, loaded with all the weight of the different paths their lives had taken. Lisa's pen hovered over her notepad, her heart pounding as she faced a choice she hadn't expected to make on this ordinary Tuesday evening. Lisa's shift ended at 9, and despite every instinct telling her to make an excuse and hurry home to her tiny apartment, she found herself sitting across from Michael in the restaurant's quiet lounge area. The other staff had given her curious looks as she'd changed out of her uniform, but she'd ignored them, focusing instead on the surreal reality of seeing her old friend again. "You look good," Michael said, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. She looked tired, worn down by years of working multiple jobs and struggling to make ends meet. Her wedding ring was gone, he'd noticed that immediately, leaving only a pale band of skin where it had once been. "You've done well for yourself," she replied, gesturing at his tailored suit and expensive watch. "I see your company in the news sometimes. I always wondered if it was really you." They talked carefully at first, dancing around the bigger questions. She told him about her divorce 2 years ago, how her ex-husband had left her with mountains of debt and a mortgage she couldn't afford on her own. She didn't mention that she'd had to sell her car last month, or that she'd been skipping meals to pay her daughter's school expenses. "I remember when you used to talk about becoming a teacher," Michael said gently. "You were so passionate about it. You had this way of explaining things that made everything seem possible." Lisa's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked them away. "Life doesn't always go according to plan, does it? I got my degree but then, well, things happened. My daughter needed stability, and teaching jobs are hard to come by. Waitressing pays better, anyway." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Teaching had been her dream, but the financial pressures of single motherhood had forced her into survival mode. Dreams had become luxuries she couldn't afford. Michael reached across the table, his hand covering hers briefly. Lisa, what if I told you that I never forgot what you did for me back in school? How you believed in me when no one else did. The moment felt heavy with unspoken possibilities. If this touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up. Lisa pulled her hand back gently, fear and hope warring in her expression. She had learned not to trust in rescue, not to believe that life offered second chances to people like her. But looking into Michael's eyes, she saw the same earnest boy who had once promised to change the world. I can't accept charity, Michael, Lisa said, her voice barely above a whisper, but her words carried the weight of years of pride carefully maintained despite everything. I won't be your project or your way of feeling good about your success. Michael leaned back, stung by her words but understanding the wall she had built around herself. That's not what this is. Lisa, you saved my life back then. Did you know that? When my dad lost his job senior year and we couldn't afford food, you shared your lunch with me every single day. You never made me feel like charity. You made it feel like friendship. The memory hit her like a gentle wave. She remembered packing extra sandwiches, pretending her mother always made too much food. She remembered how thin Michael had gotten that final semester, how he'd tried to hide his worn shoes and the way his clothes hung loose on his frame. You were my friend, she said simply. That's what friends do. Exactly, Michael replied, his voice growing stronger. That's what friends do. They help each other. And right now, I need your help more than you need mine. Lisa looked at him skeptically, her waitress instincts telling her this was just a clever way of offering assistance without wounding her pride. But something in his expression made her pause. My company has been trying to develop better training programs for our employees, Michael continued. We need someone who understands how to teach, how to connect with people from all different backgrounds. Someone who knows what it's like to work hard for every dollar. I've been looking for the right person for months. The offer hung between them, and Lisa felt her heart racing. Part of her wanted to believe it was real, that this wasn't just elaborate kindness dressed up as a business proposition. But another part of her, the part that had been disappointed too many times, whispered warnings about trusting in fairy tale endings. I haven't taught in years, she said quietly. I'm not qualified for corporate training. You taught me that I was worth something when I thought I was worthless, Michael replied. You're the most qualified person I know. Have you ever faced something like this? Let us know in the comments. Lisa sat in the soft lounge lighting, feeling 20 years of carefully built walls beginning to crack. The choice before her felt bigger than just a job. It felt like choosing to believe in herself again. I need time to think about it, Lisa said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. The restaurant around them had grown quiet, most of the evening crowd having moved on to other adventures. She could see the cleaning crew beginning their work in the dining room, the familiar rhythm of closing down that had marked the end of so many of her days. Michael nodded, understanding. Of course. But Lisa, I want you to know that this isn't about the past. Yes, I remember what you did for me, and yes, I'll always be grateful. But I'm offering you this position because I genuinely believe you're the right person for it. I've met a lot of people in business, people with impressive degrees and fancy titles. But I've never met anyone who understood people the way you do. He pulled out his business card, writing something on the back. This is my personal number. Call me when you're ready, whether it's tomorrow or next month. The position will be there. As they stood to leave, Lisa felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not the desperate kind that comes from clutching at straws, but the real kind that grows from genuine possibility. Walking to the employee parking lot, she realized Michael had followed her, his concern evident when he saw her heading toward the bus stop. Lisa, let me give you a ride home. I don't mind the bus, she said automatically, the response of someone who had learned to manage alone. I know you don't mind it, Michael replied gently. But it's late, and I'd like to make sure you get home safely. Please. The drive to her modest neighborhood was quiet, filled with the comfortable silence of old friends relearning each other's rhythms. When they pulled up to her small duplex, Lisa felt embarrassed by its contrast to the life Michael must lead, but his expression held no judgment. "Thank you," she said, meaning more than just the ride. "For everything tonight." "Thank you for giving me the chance to be your friend again," he replied. As she walked to her door, Lisa heard him call out softly, "Lisa? You were always meant for something more than just surviving. I hope you remember that." Standing on her porch, watching his expensive car disappear down the street, Lisa felt tears running down her cheeks. But for the first time in years, they weren't tears of exhaustion or despair. If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales. Tomorrow, she would have a choice to make about her future. 3 weeks later, Lisa stood in the lobby of Turner Technologies, wearing a new suit she'd carefully selected from a discount store, her heart pounding with nervous excitement. The teaching position had turned out to be everything Michael had promised and more, developing programs to help employees from all backgrounds advance in their careers, drawing on her natural ability to see potential in others. Her daughter, Rachel, had been amazed when Lisa told her about the job offer. "Mom, you're always helping people," the 16-year-old had said. "Remember how you used to help me with homework, and then you'd end up helping half my class, too? You were already a teacher, just not in a classroom." The training center Michael had shown her was beautiful, bright, welcoming spaces designed to make learning feel accessible rather than intimidating. "We get a lot of employees who never finished high school," he had explained during her tour. "People who are brilliant and hardworking but convinced they're not smart enough for advancement. I need someone who can see past their fear to their potential." Lisa had understood immediately. She had been that person herself, somewhere along the way. Someone who had forgotten her own worth in the struggle to simply survive. Now, on her first day, she looked around the lobby at the photos of company success stories, employees who had started in entry-level positions and worked their way up. Tomorrow, she would begin working with a new group of trainees, helping them see possibilities they might never have imagined for themselves. Michael appeared beside her, looking professional but warm in his role as CEO. "Ready for this?" "I think so," Lisa replied, and she meant it. The scared woman who had trembled while serving tables just 3 weeks ago felt like someone from another lifetime. She was still that person, but she was also the girl who had shared her lunch with a hungry classmate, who had believed in dreams when believing seemed foolish. "You know," Michael said as they walked toward the training center, "I hired you because you were qualified, not because of our history. But I'm grateful our paths crossed again when they did. Some friendships are meant to last forever, even when life pulls them apart for a while." Lisa smiled, feeling the truth of those words settle into her heart. She had learned something important in the past few weeks, that accepting help wasn't the same as giving up independence, and that believing in yourself sometimes required letting others believe in you first. As she opened the door to her new classroom, Lisa thought about all the people she would meet, all the dreams she might help nurture back to life. The future stretched ahead of her, full of possibility and purpose. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. Thank you for joining us on this journey of friendship, second chances, and the beautiful way life sometimes brings us exactly what we need when we're brave enough to receive it. Billionaire slipped on ice outside the diner. Waitress helped him up, not knowing he'd change her life. What if a single moment of kindness could change 2 lives forever? Outside Murphy's diner on a bitter February morning, ice covered the sidewalk like glass. The snow had been falling since midnight, blanketing the small town of Cedar Falls in pristine white. Inside the warm diner, 36-year-old Claire wiped down tables, her calloused hands moving with practiced efficiency. She'd been working double shifts for months, saving every penny she could. The bell above the door chimed constantly as locals sought refuge from the cold, ordering coffee and sharing stories about the unexpected snowstorm. Claire smiled at each customer, her genuine warmth cutting through the winter chill. She had no idea that in just a few minutes, her life would take an extraordinary turn. Sometimes the universe has a way of placing exactly the right people in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment. Where are you watching from today? Claire had grown up in Cedar Falls, watching seasons change through the diner's windows. Her grandmother had worked these same tables 40 years ago, and the owner, Mrs. Patterson, treated Claire like family. Every morning brought familiar faces, farmers grabbing coffee before dawn, teachers stopping by before school, elderly couples sharing breakfast in comfortable silence. Claire knew their usual orders, their stories, their struggles. This job meant everything to her, not just for the modest paycheck, but for the sense of belonging it provided. Her apartment above the hardware store was small but cozy, filled with books from the library and plants she'd rescued from the clearance rack. She dreamed of opening her own cafe someday, somewhere with big windows and mismatched chairs where people could linger over conversations. The old coffee tin hidden behind her flour canisters contained $3,000, her entire life savings, accumulated one tip at a time. Outside, a sleek black sedan crept carefully down Main Street, its driver unfamiliar with small-town winter driving. Behind the wheel, 42-year-old Daniel pressed the phone to his ear, his voice tense with frustration. "No, I can't reschedule the Henderson meeting. I'm already 3 hours behind because of this weather." His company had just acquired a chain of rural properties, and Cedar Falls was his final stop before returning to the city. Daniel had built his fortune through careful investments and relentless determination, but lately, success felt hollow. His penthouse apartment overlooked the city, yet he felt more isolated than ever. Relationships had withered under the pressure of endless work, and simple pleasures seemed like luxuries he couldn't afford to enjoy. The sedan slid slightly as Daniel turned into the diner's parking lot. Through the frost-covered windows, he could see warm light and people moving inside. It looked inviting, like something from a movie about simpler times. He needed coffee and directions to the Henderson property, nothing more. As he stepped out of the car, his expensive leather shoes found the icy pavement. For a successful man who controlled million-dollar deals, he had surprisingly little experience with winter weather. The first step felt steady enough, but as he reached for his briefcase, physics took over. The fall happened in slow motion. Daniel's feet slipped forward while his upper body tilted backward, arms windmilling helplessly as his briefcase scattered papers across the snowy ground. He landed hard on his back, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs and sending his phone skittering under a parked truck. For a moment, he lay there stunned, staring up at the gray sky as snowflakes melted on his face. Inside the diner, Claire had been refilling the coffee station when she heard the commotion. She glanced outside and saw a man in an expensive coat sprawled on the ice, papers blowing around him like confused birds. Without hesitation, she grabbed her own worn jacket and rushed outside, her practical boots finding sure footing on the treacherous surface. "Oh my goodness, are you hurt?" Claire knelt beside Daniel, her voice filled with genuine concern. Her warm brown eyes searched his face for signs of injury, and her gentle hands helped him sit up slowly. "Take your time, don't try to get up too fast." Daniel found himself looking into the kindest face he'd seen in years. Here was someone who had dropped everything to help a complete stranger, asking nothing in return. "I think I'm okay," he managed, though his back ached and his pride hurt worse than anything else. "Just slipped. The ice is terrible today. Here, let me help you up." Claire stood and extended her hand, her grip surprisingly strong as she helped him to his feet. She moved with easy confidence, gathering his scattered papers while keeping one eye on his stability. "You're not from around here, are you? These winters take some getting used to." As they collected his belongings, Claire noticed the expensive watch, the tailored coat, the way he carried himself despite the fall. But she treated him exactly the same as she would any customer, with respect and kindness. This simple humanity touched something deep in Daniel's chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. "Thank you," he said quietly, meaning it more than any business transaction he'd ever completed. "You didn't have to help." Claire smiled, the expression transforming her entire face. "Of course I did. That's what neighbors do." She gestured toward the diner. "Come inside and warm up. Coffee's fresh, and you look like you could use something hot." If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the biggest changes. What Daniel didn't know was that his fall had been witnessed by more than just Claire. Across the street, Henderson, the property owner he was supposed to meet, watched through his office window, making mental notes about character. Inside the warm diner, Daniel discovered a world he'd forgotten existed. Claire brought him coffee without being asked, the ceramic mug warming his hands as steam rose between them. Around him, conversations flowed naturally. Discussions about the weather, concern for elderly neighbors, plans for the upcoming church fundraiser. This wasn't the polished networking of his business world, this was real community. "I'm Claire, by the way," she said, settling across from him during a quiet moment. "I should probably know everyone who comes through here, but I don't recognize you." "Daniel," he replied, studying her face. There was something peaceful about her presence, an authenticity that made him want to lower his guard. "I'm here on business, actually. Real estate." Claire's expression shifted slightly, and Daniel caught the change. "Oh," she said quietly, her hands wrapping more tightly around her own coffee cup. "Are you working with Henderson?" The question hung in the air with unexpected weight. Daniel nodded, and he watched something sad flicker across Claire's features. "Is there a problem with that?" Claire looked around the diner, at Mrs. Patterson behind the counter, at the farmers discussing their struggles, at the worn but comfortable furniture that had served this community for decades. "Henderson's been buying up properties all over town," she said softly. "Folks are worried about what comes next." For the first time, Daniel felt the human cost of his business dealings. He'd spent months reviewing financial projections and market analyses, but he'd never considered the faces behind the numbers. "What kind of worried?" he asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. "Well, Mrs. Patterson's been trying to hold onto this place, but the taxes keep going up. Henderson's made offers on half the buildings on Main Street." Claire's voice remained gentle, but Daniel could hear the underlying concern. "People here don't have many options. Some families have been in this town for generations." Daniel stared into his coffee, seeing his reflection waver in the dark surface. His success had always been measured in quarterly reports and profit margins, but sitting here, listening to Claire, he began to understand what those numbers actually meant. Real people, real lives, real communities. The bell above the door chimed, and Henderson himself walked in, his eyes immediately finding Daniel. "There you are," Henderson called out, his voice carrying across the quiet diner. "Ready to close some deals? Have you ever faced a moment that changed how you see everything? Let us know in the comments." Daniel stood slowly, acutely aware that his next decision would ripple far beyond this small diner. Henderson's handshake was firm, his smile confident as he gestured toward a corner booth. "Sorry about the delay, but weather's weather, right?" He spread several contracts across the table, his pen already moving. "I've got 3 more properties lined up after our meeting, so let's make this quick." Daniel found himself looking back at Claire, who was carefully avoiding their conversation while serving other customers. Her earlier words echoed in his mind as Henderson outlined plans for demolishing several buildings to make way for a shopping complex. The numbers were impressive, the profit potential enormous, but Daniel couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Patterson's weathered hands and the way Claire had helped him without expecting anything in return. "The Patterson property is the keystone," Henderson continued, pointing to a highlighted section. "Once we secure the diner, the rest falls into place. I've been wearing down the old lady for months. She can't afford the upcoming tax assessment." Something cold settled in Daniel's stomach. "Mrs. Patterson owns this place?" "For now. But she's behind on payments, and I've got friends at the county office." Henderson's smile turned predatory. "Sometimes you have to apply pressure where it counts." Daniel's pen remained motionless above the signature line. Across the diner, he watched Claire refill an elderly man's coffee, her smile genuine as she asked about his grandchildren. This was what Henderson wanted to destroy, not just buildings, but the heart of a community. "I need a moment," Daniel said quietly, standing from the table. Henderson's eyebrows rose. "It's a simple signature, Matthews. We've been planning this for months." But Daniel was already walking toward the counter, his decision crystallizing with each step. Claire looked up as he approached, her expression curious but guarded. Mrs. Patterson, he called softly to the older woman behind the register. Could I speak with you for a moment? What happened next surprised everyone in the diner, including Daniel himself. Instead of representing Henderson's interests, he found himself explaining the development plans, warning Mrs. Patterson about the pressure tactics, and offering something unexpected, his protection as an investor who could outbid Henderson for the properties. The transformation in the room was immediate. Henderson's face darkened with fury, but the relief in Mrs. Patterson's eyes was worth every dollar Daniel was about to spend. If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales. Claire stared at Daniel in amazement, finally understanding that sometimes angels arrive in expensive coats, carrying briefcases instead of wings. 6 months later, Main Street buzzed with a different kind of energy. Instead of demolition, renovation had breathed new life into the old buildings. Daniel had purchased not just the properties, but Henderson's entire development package, transforming the aggressive expansion into thoughtful preservation. The diner remained exactly as it was, while the buildings around it became artist studios, a community center, and affordable housing for young families. Claire stood outside her own cafe, watching Daniel hand-paint the final details on her sign. Falling Snow Cafe, curved across the window in elegant letters, with smaller text underneath, where every cup tells a story. Her dream had materialized through Daniel's investment, but more importantly, through the trust they'd built together. You know, I never thanked you properly, Daniel said, wiping paint from his hands with a rag that had seen better days. He'd traded his expensive suits for jeans and flannel shirts, finding more satisfaction in manual work than he'd ever discovered in boardroom negotiations. Claire laughed, the sound carrying the warmth that had first captured his attention. For what? You're the one who saved the whole town. For helping me up, Daniel replied seriously. Not just from the ice, but from the life I was living. He'd moved to Cedar Falls permanently, establishing a foundation that supported small-town businesses across the region. His city penthouse sat empty while he rented a small apartment above the hardware store, 3 doors down from Claire's place. Mrs. Patterson emerged from the original diner, carrying a steaming plate of her famous apple pie. You two stop working and eat something, she scolded gently, though her eyes sparkled with affection. The stress lines had disappeared from her face, replaced by the contentment of knowing her life's work would continue. The late afternoon sun painted everything golden as the 3 of them sat on the cafe's front porch, sharing pie and watching neighbors wave as they passed. Daniel had discovered that true wealth wasn't measured in bank accounts, but in the richness of relationships and the peace that came from living with purpose. Claire reached over and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his naturally. Did you ever imagine that slipping on ice could lead to all this? Daniel squeezed her hand gently, marveling at how completely his life had changed. Best fall I ever took, he said, and meant every word. The snow began falling again, but this time it felt like a blessing rather than an obstacle. Sometimes the greatest treasures are found not in what we plan, but in what we never see coming. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. Thank you for joining us on this journey of discovering that kindness truly can change everything.